back to the Daily Grind. Thanks for checking out the channel. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back pickle biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA.
Now, full-time family, you know I usually don't do this. I usually don't break news, but let me be the first to tell you, Joe Rogan's gonna be leaving the UFC sometime in the next 2 years. That's not official. I haven't heard that from any MMA outlets. That's just what this looks like, because veteran, color, commentator, Bellator extraordinaire, commentating extraordinaire Jimmy Smith has signed with the UFC in a clear effort to replace Joe Rogan. And I'm not saying he's trying to replace Joe Rogan. I'm just saying the UFC has to move on from Joe Rogan in some way. We all know Joe Rogan is a staple to the UFC. There's a lot of people that say no Joe, no show. Joe Rogan, we know Joe Rogan from Fear Factor. A lot of us grew up watching Joe Rogan on Fear Factor. Then dude hopped on like the Man Show. Then he was been doing stand-up comedy the whole time, on top of the podcast that a lot of people listen to, on top of being one of the most knowledgeable commentators the UFC has ever saw. So Joe Rogan is a big part of the UFC for a lot of people. He really, whenever Joe Rogan's not there, the first few times, it definitely felt weird. And so what happened is Joe Rogan has lightened his workload, you know, and you wouldn't be lightening your workload if you were planning on fucking hitting it hard in 2019. Joe Rogan went from like calling every UFC show to, I believe, just the pay-per-views or just the North American shows, and then now he's on just North American pay-per-views. And in this time when he's been lightening his workload, we've been seeing the John Anik, the Brian Stans, the Daniel Cormiers, the Paul Felders, all of these people coming into the commentating booth, and you know, 3-man teams, 2-man teams, just the Tyron Woodley even jumped on there to commentate the Wonder Boy Masvidal fight, which was actually super dope. So the UFC's been trying out a lot of things, and now with Joe Rogan, with his schedule light as it's ever been, and with his podcast and his stand-up comedy booming just like anything else he's doing, Joe Rogan doesn't really, and you know, this isn't a fact, he talks about everything on his podcast, and he hasn't came out and said, yo, I'm not having fun with the UFC. He's never said that. Of course he loves it, but he's just got a lot of shit to do, and the way his podcast is growing, it probably, you would just, as a person, I mean, you would understand why somebody would rather do their own thing than continue to travel show after show after show. I mean, of course we all love Joe, but this is a personal thing, and this is just something that I see coming. I mean, Jimmy Smith, a lot of people make the joke that he looks like Joe Rogan. He's Joe Rogan 2.0. But if you actually know the history, Jimmy Smith was bald-headed before Joe Rogan, which you learned from Jimmy Smith on Joe Rogan's podcast, which is where I learned it. He said it was funny because when Joe Rogan shaved his head, they already knew that everybody was going to start assuming Jimmy Smith was trying to be like Joe Rogan. And it's funny that he was in fact the first bald-head commentator, and Jimmy Smith has been commentating for a long time. Him and Joe Rogan aren't even like the same type of person, but that is a common joke. I mean, whenever I first got into the sport and I didn't know about Jimmy Smith, I thought Bellator was just trying to get a Joe Rogan knockoff. You know what I'm saying? Like, have their own version of Joe Rogan, because everyone joked about Bellator as the knockoff of the UFC. Jimmy Smith is the knockoff of Joe Rogan. You know, they're doing everything. It was just, you know, it was really funny because they had similarities in their appearance. But now that Jimmy Smith is actually with the UFC, we know that Bellator signed Big John McCarthy to their commentating team. They've got Chael Sonnen. They've also got, I believe, maybe Mauro Ranallo. They've also got Mike Goldberg from the UFC. So this is crazy, bro. Check this out. Go back 2 years. And this is what I've said in the previous video. I mean, I've never heard anything about this happening, but the Bellator and the UFC, they could be making trades like the fucking Patriots and the Broncos make trades, bro. Because look, they literally have swapped commentating, a commentator. Look, Jimmy Smith used to be one of Bellator's staple commentators. Mike Goldberg was a UFC staple commentator. They've literally switched now. Goldberg is with Bellator. Jimmy Smith is with the UFC. That is fucking baffling. And the way it all happened, clearly, you know, it's weird. Mike Goldberg, I mean, we don't know all the details, and so there's not really much you can talk about there with why did Mike Goldberg leave the UFC. I mean, we've heard him explain it, but there's two sides to every story than the truth. And all I'm saying is it's just very interesting that Jimmy Smith is now with the UFC and Mike Goldberg is now with Bellator. That's just fucking weird and cool because both of these guys are great at their job. Bellator has released a press release that said now we've got commentators that have spent more time in the actual octagon than outside of the octagon. Chael Sonnen spent a lot of time in the octagon as a fighter. Big John McCarthy spent a lot of time in the octagon as a referee. So that's always that in itself, the Big John McCarthy signing, super appealing, super interesting, because I'm looking forward to hearing a referee's perspective on the commentating team. That's going to be dope. I think his name is Mark Ratner, who Joe Rogan and them will call in sometimes when they have a rule question. But that's going to, I think Bellator's commentating team and the UFC's, either way, they're both extraordinary. This really isn't super big news, except for the fact that Jimmy Smith and Mike Goldberg have now traded places, which I just thought about in this video. But also, I said Joe Rogan's going to be leaving the UFC soon. That is completely just my own thought. I haven't heard that from anybody. But we do know that Joe Rogan has been lightening his workload. And now there's a guy that looks like Joe Rogan that's going to be sitting next to Joe Rogan. So I don't see how long that's going to go. Just to the visual, as me, it's like really, like, if you know how they flash to the commentators in between fights and you see them talking to each other, what are you going to have? Joe Rogan, John Anik, and then Jimmy Smith in the middle, like these two bald dudes that kind of have, you know, favor each other, and then someone in the middle talking. Like, how is that going to work? Are Jimmy Smith and Joe Rogan ever going to be on the commentating booth the same night? Are they going to have Joe Rogan some nights and Jimmy Smith on the nights Joe Rogan's not available? How the hell is this about to go with Jimmy Smith and Joe Rogan at the UFC? It's interesting. My thought is Joe Rogan's probably preparing to retire from his commentating duties and just continue with the podcasting and the stand-up comedy, and Jimmy Smith will fill in for Joe Rogan, and whenever super casual fans tune in, they might not notice Joe Rogan's gone, but of course us hardcore fans will be here watching and remembering Joe Rogan and Mike Goldberg as Mike. Alright, you get the point. It is what it is. Let the full-time family know what you think in the comments. I gotta get this Charles Felony Bennett interview soon, man. Hopefully in 12 minutes. That shit's about to go down. It was supposed to happen in 2 days, but we done moved up the date. I can't fucking wait. It is what it is. Let the full-time family know what you think in the comments, because I'm out.
Da 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 da. It's the motherfucking DOWG.